Uh, Today we are starting uh, first of the two lectures on history. We are not going to discuss any specific event of history, but actually we are going to discuss what is history and what is the problem in the understanding of history and why we are not able to understand history. And since we don't understand history, what are the consequences? What could be the consequences? And what, in fact, are the consequences? It is generally understood, and the history shows, that who don't understand their history, their geography abandons them. Once people don't know their history or don't understand their history, their geography gets annoyed and their geography abandons them. Let us see that are we facing this situation? In fact, yes. And then there must be a reason that why don't we understand history? And the main problem is that we don't differentiate between history and historiography. The first thing is that we don't understand history, but along with that, the major problem is that we don't differentiate between history and historiography. And during the course of discussion, I'll try to clarify the meaning of the two. Our worldview defines our position in the universe. This was our first lecture. We started with the worldview, and today we are discussing the historical view. And our view of history fixes our position on the globe, on this planet, in space and in time. History is so important. Historiography designs tools we need to manage these positions. If we don't understand historiography and we don't develop those tools, we cannot fix our position like GPS. We cannot find our position as on GPS through the worldview or through the view of the history. That is why we are failing, that we have not developed those tools. History is the knowledge acquired by inquiry and investigation. It is not just a social media or a sermon from a pulpit. It is a proper inquiry and investigation. I leave it to, including myself, let us leave it to our own selves and find out that whatever we know, whatever we think about history, and whatever we know about history, about any fact, have we ever gone into inquiry? Have we ever investigated any event? But this is, we know only what we have heard. The term history encompasses past and its memory, discovery about it, and the collection and organization of facts, evidence, and presentation and interpretation, how we are able to present it and interpret it. History is not only reading and writing. We have always limited the definition only to reading and writing. But historiography includes excavating. Archaeology is part of it, very important part of it. It's part of natural history also. Unfolding, drilling down, looking up closer and wider, viewing, and at the same time visualizing. If we are not doing all these things, we are not doing historiography. And if we are not doing historiography, we are failing to understand history. And that is why we are not being accepted even by our own geography. There is a deliberate murder of history taking place all the time. History is distorted before birth. If any event is going to take place, for example, I'm talking about the powers, big powers, superpowers in the history. Whenever they plan an event, they're going to war, for example, before the war, they start distorting, they start misguiding, misrepresenting the facts so that the history is distorted before birth. And then it takes a lot of time to unearth it, to rediscover it. It takes centuries sometimes. Or if any event takes place during that time, then it is murdered at birth. You must have been watching nowadays on TV and electronic media, on social media, new theories coming about wars. I give you an example. For example, when Muslims conquered, when, say, let us fix it in time, when Iraq, from the forces landed from Iraq in Sindh, Muhammad bin Qasim conquered Sindh Empire at that time. Throughout the history, it has been presented as if that was the first feminine war of Islam. Hajjaj bin Yusuf had heard the cry of women and he sent the forces and they conquered it. This was not done only by Muslims. In other cases also, even today, you must be hearing that such and such war took place because of providing assistance to such and such people, or for saving the children, or for saving the women in that country. That is why the country was invaded. Deliberate murder of history. Historians know that all sources, even those original to a particular historical time period, have some biases, omissions, contradictions, or various other limitations. Historians know this. Therefore, first of all, it is foremost and foremost important for the historians that they must verify the source and must see whether there is an omission, whether there is any contradiction. Whereas the other people like me, when they read it, we read the history, or we listen to the history, or we hear it, whatever is given to read or whatever is given to hear. Historians, and now here I'm going to give the difference between the historians and non-historians. Let us decide whether we belong to the historians or we belong to the group of non-historians. Historians emphasize the value of primary source. Do we discuss these things, the primary source? And on this account, I myself belong to the non-historians. Non-historians read books only. They listen to the sermons. That is how they collect history. I belong to the non-historians group. Another distinction, non-historians assume that history has always to be approached, that history has always been approached the same way. There has been no change. If somebody was assassinated, he was assassinated. There's no need to go into the inquiry, into the details, into the sources. Historians understand that philosophy and methodology of history changes over time. And sometimes we find some facts which never happened. But the history has been reporting all along and we have been believing all along. Historians try to recognize the difference between facts and interpretations. What we are receiving today, most of the time, are the interpretations. Somebody saw some event from an angle and he interpreted it in a particular way. And it was reported in a particular way by Tabari, by Balazari, by anyone. And we start looking at it from that angle, from that interpretation, not from the facts. Historiography refers to the history, to the philosophy, and to the methodology of history. All these three things we are missing. That is why if we are 2 billion Muslims today, out of 2 billion, more than 99% of us, we don't know our own history. We don't understand our own history. Non-historians like me make broad generalizations about people, ideas, events, or time periods in history. We, for example, we say Khilafatul Rashidun, we say such and such empire, such and such period, Mughals after Aurangzeb and Mughals before Aurangzeb, generalizations. And historians focus more on developments that underpin generalizations. Non-historians assume that time periods are fixed and absolute. We generally assume that. Whereas historians have various ways of organizing history thematically. I will show the difference. That how Europe changed its mind and started presenting and studying their history thematically, and we have remained confined to the old classical view of history. Europeans adopted the method of periodization. Now, periodization to historians is just a convenient form of broad organization. We are not studying history, our history, through periodization, whereas Europe adopted this practice long ago. These are the problems with the understanding of, with our understanding of history. Historians cannot be totally objective, yes, they are subjective also. They have limitations, they have biases, but they should at least adopt the methodology. But here the problem is that even our historians, we have seen in the universities, and we have seen the books which are being produced or theses which are being produced, they are not looking at these shortcomings. Historians do not place values, beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes of the present onto the topics they study. For example, today, if there is someone is a hero in the history, we have attached spirituality or divinity to that person, we continue to believe and pursue that. Whereas if there is a true historian, a researcher, he will not start with that assumption. He will start with a free mind. Historians try to understand their topics, and since we are not the historians, we don't do that. The context of how and why people of that era thought and behaved, and not how people think and act today. We are looking at the history through the mind of the people and their mind, which has been developed and which has been stratified, which has been fossilized through faith. We are looking at history through faith. Historiography has further been sidelined. So far, whatever I've discussed, it is because of our own shortcomings, limitations. We don't take pains. We don't make any research. These are our shortcomings. And there's another factor which has sidelined the historiography, and we have totally lost it. We are not even aware of it in the universities even. Besides religion, scientific developments have also sidelined historiography. And we think that science is everything. So historiography needs to be brought closer to social sciences, human mind, and feelings, capable of not only recording chronology, but explaining transformations of man and society over time, in time, on the timeline of history. We are not going into that exercise. We have mixed up history with a totally different species, which is not of the species of history. We have mixed it up with myth, not supported by evidence. We have mixed it up with mystery, not supported by evidence. You will find that history has gaps. In our history, there are gaps. Somebody disappeared, somebody reappeared, somebody will reappear. No evidence, no logic, no timeline, no historiography, waiting for Mahdi, waiting for Masiha. These are the gaps which we have created ourselves. And then the other factor is, there are barriers between what happened and our own capacity, which have not been developed to observe and understand in time, remotely today, unable to penetrate beyond limitations of language. The history which was recorded in language, now we have no access to the tools, and we have not made an effort into the root of that word, of that language. And this is another barrier which we have erected and which we have fortified. Course is too contingent for causal explanation of the cause and effect, the causal explanation. Therefore, options in history are endless. If we go into the theory of cause and effect, what caused the civil war? What caused the first fitna? You must have seen, we all the time mourn the first fitna and we tragedize the first fitna. We speak about it, but we don't go into the analysis of the cause and effect. And history cannot be understood without understanding the cause and effect, as we cannot understand science without understanding the cause and effect. The major immediate political danger, this is another aspect, to historiography today is anti-universalism, color, race, ethnicity, geography, territory, language, anti-universalism. We are divided. This attitude emerges in different ways, in which central issue of history is not what happened. In the history which we are presenting today, we are not concerned what happened, how it happened, what was the cause and effect, but how the group feels, how each group feels that it happened or it should have happened. Everybody is content that what Muawiyah did and how that happened and what Ali did, that happened. But more than that, we are concerned that how it should have happened. This is our approach to history, that how history should have happened, without analyzing all these things which I have discussed so far. What is important to this kind of historiography? I'm using new term. Now, instead of historiography, we have invented dysteriography, distorted historiography. It is not rational. It does not present a rational explanation, but not a meaning. Not what happened, but what memories of a group define and feel about it. What a particular group, what a particular sectarian group feels about it. It should have happened like that. And that is how we only discuss and mourn that part which happened the way we feel that it should have happened, not the way the cause and effect, no analysis, no historical analysis that how it happened, why it happened. And we usually depend on sermons, oration from the pulpit, from the madrasa, from the khutbah. As I said, it is not only reading and writing, it is historiography. And it needs a lot of excavation, unfolding, drilling down, going deeper, raising questions, discussing, researching. After Quran, anything we orate for sawab is the history. After Quran, any subject, including hadith, part of hadith which is history, anything which we read or we recite, we do it for sawab. We present the history of in the hadith as sawab. We present the history of the imams as sawab. We present the history of the khulafa as sawab. On the foundation of our faith. We have not yet come out of this aspect, and we are not studying history as historiography. Story is common to a particular faith or culture but not supported by external, independent, critical sources, are usually considered the base material for oration. And we have seen from the pulpit in the mosques, in the khutbahs, how they present the history, how they add the in a particular chanting voice. This is not history. History is not read like that. History is a dispassionate subject without passion. Study of history includes its examination, queries, analysis, investigation of their patterns of cause and effect. Patterns. As I said, Europe adopted the policies, adopted the practice of periodization. Their universities adopted this. We have not done that. We are still going after dynasties, after persons, not about periodization, or not about periods. And number two, besides periodization, the pattern of cause and effect. Not only the pattern, but the pattern of cause and effect. How the cause moves and how the effect moves, in what pattern they move. History is not just reason as an end in itself. History is not an end in itself. History is about debating the nature and course of history. You can't discuss or debate any event of any sect in their, particularly in their arena, in their territory, in their masjid, in their madrasa. You can't then return safe from there if you debate with them. They don't hold a seminar. And its usefulness to provide perspective on the problems of the present. Otherwise, history has no aim. History in itself has no aim, no aim. The aim of the history is to debate, to find a solution to the present problem. If the history fails on that, it means we fail on that account. It means we are not reading history. We are not taking lessons from history. The past, now these are not my words, but this is an observation. The last 45 years, half a century, is considered to be a golden age for the mass invention of emotionally skewed historical untruths. Because during this half of a century, a lot of media has developed, and all the media is false, untruth. Social media has added another dimension of untruth and myths. Some of them are a public danger. That is how the history is being presented. And memory boom in history through media. They are murdering history before birth. They are murdering history at the birth of at the time of birth, and that is being put into the hard disk, so that after 100 years, after 50 years, whenever people have access to the any source and they go for research, they will find into these papers, into these journals, into these hard disks, and from they will retrieve the data. And even after 100 years or 50 years, the history will be misrepresented. This is the danger which is being perpetuated. Historiography as a branch of knowledge studies, not reads, studies human history as a change over time, change on the timeline, change with the time. We are not changing. We are not ready to understand the change since the last 1500 years. We are still standing in Mecca. We are still standing in Medina. We are still standing in Kufa. We are still standing in Damascus. It may recount, the historiography recounts all or some aspects such as political, social, economic, scientific, and so on. You can't interpret the actions of Umar in the on the basis of economic analysis. You can't explain the agricultural policy of Usman on the basis of agricultural economics. Because if you have to read you have to present the history, you have to present the history of these people, pious people, of course, pious people for the sake of sawab only. Historiography has been used in developing history. This is a very important lesson. Historiography has been used in developing history as discipline of study using particular sources, techniques, and theoretical approaches for political purposes. That is why, and that is how, from the 15th century, the colonialists colonized Indian subcontinent. They colonized Africa, and they subsequently colonized through the misnomer of a mandate whole of Middle East. This is through the understanding, learning of historiography. In that period, you will find that the universities and their foreign departments and their defense departments sending hundreds of people with hefty scholarships to these territories, learning their languages, collecting their data, collecting their material, compiling them, and using that material for their purpose. They produced Alif Laila, they produced Yusuf and Zulekha, they produced Hidayah in the Indian subcontinent. They produced so many things to distort the culture and history, and they presented in a way they wanted. And when these people finished their job, when they came back, they were given pensions also. They were given the protection. They were provided all the perks as a civil servant's gifts. And almost every civil servant, when the colonialists came, they were all scholars also. Historiographers played an important role in providing crucial material to the colonialists to wage wars. This is another aspect of history. Research interests change over time. For example, shift from traditional diplomatic, economic, and political history towards social and cultural studies. Today, in the West, in Europe, in America, the history is being studied within a particular aim at social and cultural problems to solve them. History is being used for that purpose. But still, we are reading history from the foundation of our faith. Historiography endeavors to know the nature of the present, in order to understand the nature of the present by understanding what the what the past brought into the present. What were the dynamics of the past which has developed this situation of present for us? Why are we in this present, this type of present? How the past developed it? It describes the development of the past into the present as it continues to develop, and how our present today, with all this illiteracy, with all this poverty, with all these problems, ignorance, is going to shape the future. We don't know. We don't have studies. History has been divided by us. History is chronological record of past events as understood and interpreted. We understand differently and we interpret it differently, totally different from the facts. Historians continue to rewrite and reinterpret history. History is never static. Book of history is not written like the last time. There's no final book on history. The history will continue to be rewritten every time. History is a record of event in a period, and historiography, in contrast to history, historiography studies how history was written, by whom, and underwent what influences in a time period. Historiography refers to history is philosophy and methodology. I mentioned earlier, which is important, I'm repeating it. It is the study of historical writing. It is the method of studying now. Now the history is written and rewritten. as our ability to historical understanding changes over time. As our ability will change, will improve, as the new technology will become available, new information will be available, the history will be rewritten, and we should be again we should have skill in that regard. We are not even ready to read Quran and understand Quran on the timeline of history. We are reading Quran with a statical mind, with a static mind. History is not a one-time exercise. History is not written as one-time exercise, but it is rewritten, rewritten, and rewritten continuously. It is a continuous process. Historiography examines approaches of historians as to how and why their theories of history, like Ibn Khaldun, and interpretations differ. Ibn Khaldun has explained it. Toynbee has explained it. Benfinger has explained this. That why their theories differ. Historiography also explores why historical events are interpreted differently over time. It also examines bias. There will always remain bias in the history. And those who prepare material and those who shape history. Now, this is the difference. That who prepare the material for history and who shape the history. Philosophers and scholars, they prepare and process material of history and material for history. For those people who shape the history. For example, Aristotle prepared the material and shaped Alexander to reshape the history. Nehru prepared the material for Indira Gandhi. He wrote letters to Indira Gandhi from jail, and those were compiled, and that is today called the history of India. And he shaped Indira Gandhi to take over India as the Prime Minister ultimately. So this is how the history and the shaping and reshaping of the makers of history takes place. But let us understand that what is the difference in these people. Leader guides in the direction. Guides in the direction determined by history and ideology, by GPS, and as chosen by him. I want to go to Katy. I need a direction. It has been determined. It is in a direction. Somebody can take me in this direction. This is the work of the guide, the leader. But the great leader rises above the archaeum to give direction to history in the making. History is always in the making. History is all the time coming to become modern history. The great leaders, they give direction to the history, not to the person only. And statesman, this is the difference between leader, great leader, and the statesman. The statesman changes the course of history. This is the difference. The statesman, we don't have a statesman. Today we don't have a statesman. It's a big statement that today, unfortunately, we don't have a statesman, person of caliber of a statesman. The great difference lies in the gradient in their statures. A statesman is the person who can rise above the Himalayas to change the course of courses and the ways, paths, even in the sky. Some present history in pieces, as thesis, antithesis, the presented as pieces. Marx presented in two halves. Interpreting history is interpreting the world and humanity. You can't piece it. You can't separate it. The wholesome interpretation is required. Interpreting history is interpreting the world and humanity. I had started from there, from worldview and the view of history. History does not open up and reveal its truth in a mindset. If I have a mindset that 1500 years ago, this event took place like this because I heard it from some mullah, and I continue to have a mindset, closed mindset, then history will not speak to me. It will not open up. Why it should tell the truth to me? When seen on a single track in a direction, the history hides its wider hind and side views, its closes. It hides whole range and heights of Himalaya from narrow angle. This is the bias of history. It hides the geography. It hides the space. It hides the time. We lag behind. It doesn't open up in between the lines. There's a lot of wisdom in between the lines in the history. It doesn't open up because we have mindset. And therefore, the history doesn't tell us the truth. What happened? It does not allow overview and drill down to the dull mind. History works frankly only with the willing worker who is frank and intimate with history. Quran says that only those people touch Quran, become intimate with Quran, develop intimate friendship with Quran, whose mind is pure, open, and they come to Quran with open mind. Now, what is history? There are different types of history. Cosmos is the open history, Kitabun Mubin. Archaeology is the preserved history, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has preserved for us. Wal Marjan. In the Marjan, there is millions of years history of climate. And then archives, these are the cosmos, archaeology, and archives. Archives, if we don't open up the archives, they will be eaten up by the moth, by the termite. We will lose them. And we are losing them. We are losing libraries because the books are not being opened. We are losing the pages of Quran because we are not opening them. Scientists' eye can see history of billions of years from a Big Bang in just one ray of light. This is vision. History cannot be confined in a classroom. Come out in the open. Wal Quran, Kana Mashuda, Wal Fajr. Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inviting attention to Quran, to Fajr, that it is worth observation? Come out from the Hujra, come out in the open. History requires bigger canvas. Sky is no limit. Beyond the black hole, people have seen the universe. Wider view, and above all, the vision. Without vision, we cannot go for historiography. And if you don't go for historiography, we can't go for history. And if you don't know the history, we don't know our geography. If not reason into, history doesn't disclose reason behind happenings and doesn't impart any lesson. That is why we are not taking any lesson. History doesn't increase the unwise person in his wisdom. It doesn't forcibly teach the untaught. It makes teaching material out of such people for others to take lesson. And now today, history is making material from us, from our own material, as a lesson for others. It teaches those who think into it and reason out with it. History gets locked up in closed mind. History requires clean hands, clean mind, open options and multilateral approach. It may be altogether differently provoking if we try to find out the truth that no, it didn't happen like that. It was totally a different view. It's a totally a different view. And we sometimes get astonished that what I have been reading, what I was told. This throws a bigger challenge to the belief that reality is all structured and self-evident and needs scientific methodology only. Even the scientists are mistaken here. They think that reality is only this science, reality is only this material. No, reality lies behind and above the material, even above the metaphysics. There is a world behind the physical, there is a world behind the metaphysical. Science is not the limit. Even the science has created a barrier. I've shown in the beginning that they have put a barrier to the historiography. Chronology, now I'm coming to the periodization, what Europe has done. Chronology is the sequence of events from the first to the last. We can then break them into blocks. This breaking into blocks is called periodization. Now, what is it? Periodization divides the past into blocks of time. On what basis? To study and analyze history in order to understand it, what the current and historical processes, but above all, the causality, the cause of the events, the cause of the effect. And the periodization has been done on that basis. I will show there are different types of periodization which they have done. Without periodization, the past remains scattered without a structure to understand. Egyptian history, ancient Egyptian history, it is very difficult to understand because it is not in the straight line. With every dynasty, the cyclic time changed. Chinese ancient history, with every dynasty, the line changed. It's difficult to fix it, but the scientific method was developed by Europe. Contemporary periodization of history is based on Western historians' view of division of blocks of time. They have their blocks of time. We can develop our own theory to develop the blocks of time. It needs careful study, but we have not yet done it. Now, these are different periodizations. We are not going into those details. These are some religious period. There is some religious periodization by the Christians, by Jews, by the Britishers, and now the change is taking place. Periodization as a spectrum. Renaissance and Reformation combined refer to the start of early modern period. Now you will find that people are not using dates. They are referring to the events and their causes, their effects. They are creating a spectrum, and they are creating they are doing periodization on the basis of the shades of light on that spectrum. I'm not going into these details. For example, now instead of talking of 60s, they're talking of long 60s. Instead of talking of 19th century, they're talking of long 19th century. This requires a lot of explanation, and I'm not going into these details. I'm just exposing these things to you. On the spectrum of shorter timeline, it has a purpose. Shorter timeline. Now, in history of Europe, Middle Ages, here we are doing great injustice to our own history. In the history of Europe, Middle Ages, also referred as medieval ages, it is also referred as the Dark Ages. And this is the period which is the period of ascendance of Islam from 5th to 15th century. And I have read myself in the books written by many Muslim scholars referring to the Dark Ages, to this period as the Dark Ages in the Muslim history. Although this is the period which is referred to as the Dark Ages in the European history, but without understanding the difference, they use this terminology even in the Muslim history for the same period from 5th to 15th century. because of lack of understanding of periodization and its background. Middle Ages, and this is breakup of that Dark Ages, 5th to 10th century, also called Dark Ages, from 1000 to 1250 to 1500. This entire period, early medieval, high medieval, late medieval, that the total medieval period is the Dark Ages. And we refer to this Dark Ages when we write history, when in our own history, as the Dark Ages. This is the period from the birth of the Prophet to 15th century when Muslims left Spain. We don't understand history, therefore don't understand the geography. After ruling for 700 years in Spain, when they left, there's no mosque left there, no Muslim left there. Medieval period, I've explained that so that the distinction becomes clearer. Collectively, those events are called crises of late Middle Ages for Europe. But we are using this terminology in Muslim history. Now, these are not my words, these are the words of Cantor. Absorption of Latin texts started before Renaissance of 12th century. The philosophy written in Latin language, he's referring to that the philosophy written in Latin language started to be understood, assimilated, absorbed from the 12th century beginning through contact with Arabs. Otherwise, the Greek philosophy had gone. Arabs translated them, and then it was translated back. In one of my lectures, I had shown that the Arabs, when they collected the books, they translated them into Arabic, and Arabic became the language of philosophy and science, advanced language. And when Europe again took over, they retranslated back into Latin, into Greek, into Aramaic, into English, into so many other languages. And they even changed the names, Averroes, Abyssinia. Through contact with Arabs and capture of Constantinople by Ottoman Turks, when many Byzantine scholars had to seek refuge in the West, particularly Italy. At that time, it was under Muslim influence. Morocco is called West, Maghreb. Spain. Expansion of Ottoman Empire cut off trade with East. European trade was cut with the East. Europeans sought new trading routes leading to Spain, to Spanish expedition under Christopher Columbus to Americas in 1492 and Vasco da Gama to Africa and India in 1498. These discoveries strengthened the economy and power of European nations on the basis of the literature, the maps, the instrumentation already developed in the Muslim world. Combined with this influx of ideas was the invention of printing. Now, here we blocked our way. They opened up the way by allowing the printing press, and we stopped it, which facilitated dissemination of printed word and democratized learning in Europe, in the West, and we lagged behind. Those two things led to Protestant reformation of the church. The first articles were written by Martin Luther, and that paved the way for Protestant reformation. And at that time, the Ottoman Empire helped them, helped Germany, helped Portugal, helped Transylvania. Toward the end of this period came the age of discovery, discovery of new world, Americas, India. Then started the modern period. And it is in this period I had spoken of the thematic approach to history. Now the emphasis in history shifted from chronology to theme, to solving the problems of people I've already mentioned, for reducing poverty, for improving labor laws, for caring for the ill, and for other humanitarian endeavors. They started using history for social benefit. It was the same history was used for colonialization, and the same history is today being used for the benefit of the people, but we are still lagging behind. Now, what is the lesson? I've already mentioned this lesson. I'm not repeating it. Periodization, thematic approach, and changing of approach from chronology to solving the problems of the people using history, historiography. Now, what is the way forward? It is time to re-establish the coalition, connection of those who believe. Let them join hands, those who believe in this theory. In history, those who believe in history as a rational inquiry, not as a dogmatic approach, not as a dogma, not as a blind faith, into the course of human transformation against those who distort history for political purposes. However, I'll end this is the last slide, with the saying of Osborne: there should be an approach of total history. I have mentioned this earlier also. Wholesome history, not in pieces, not in thesis and antithesis, not like Marx. And a total approach. How? Not a history of everything. It is not possible. I can't know everything. There are specializations, but history as an indivisible web, total approach, in which all human activities are interconnected, with a human approach, with a humane approach to solve the problems of the people. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzat amma yasifun wa salamun ala mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. You can open your mics and start the discussion as you like.
Okay, Justice Shazad, I'll start with thanks for the topic. Now, since you differentiated between history and historiography, how do you look? You haven't listed some of what people consider Islamic historians, like Imam al-Tabari, Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Battuta, Ibn Khaldun, al-Jabatri, and so on. Are they historian in the definition that you were given, or they just historiographicals?
In this list, I think the names which are Tabari or Ibn Ishaq, they may be called historians, maybe, but not the historiographers. I think Ibn Khaldun is the historiographer. This is the difference. Sorry.
No, but you define a history that it's the person of actually who knowledge acquired by inquiry and investigation.
Yeah.
Is that means, I mean, if I looked at Ibn Battuta, he's probably the only one that I remember that he went all over the world, to study whatever was there. Is that, but I don't, is any of them, I'm asking a question because frankly, I don't know. Is Imam al-Tabari went through, excavation, unfolding, drilling down and so on, or he was just recording whatever he heard or was there at that time?
I hold Tabari in very, very high esteem. He is a great scholar, and if there was no Tabari, we would have no classical writings. We would know Ibn Ishaq, we would have no Sira. This is a great they have a great importance. But when we read Tabari, 6 volumes, at most of the places he simply says that this news has reached me. Who gave this news? Who was the person? What was the source? Where is the reference? In many cases, he simply says that the news has reached me. News has reached me. That does not lead us anywhere if we want to conduct any history, any research. And at many places, not one place, At many places, it is contradictory also, and it is confusing also. But yet, since it is the classical original source, we have to go to that source and study because we have no other source in the Muslim world. If we have to write history of a Sira, we have to go to Ibn Ishaq. Otherwise, we can't write it. Ibn Ishaq is limited to Sira mostly.
Yeah.
These are the
Thanks.
problems.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam alaikum, sir.
Yeah, I agree with you about Tabari, that he has not produced things that, give as references. But one thing that stands out about Mr. Tabari is that he has written many volumes, but if you read the preface of Tabari, the level of integrity he has, he writes in his preface that whatever I'm writing is based on hearsay. Somebody told me this, I wrote. I do not give any guarantee that whatever things I'm writing in these volumes are 100% reliable. And that impressed me a lot. Not too many historians are able to say that. And I thought to add this point to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this elaboration. And I also said the same thing, that I hold him in a very high esteem. He's an honest person. But at the same time, when we don't find the reference, which he has already admitted himself. So he is great because of his honesty and because of his writings and the volumes and the information which he has collected. We have no other source, but we have to go to Tabari. But the problem is that at that time, that was the way of writing. That we have received this news. We have received this news, but who gave this, we don't know.
Also, this may also reflect that Tabari, or in the time, most of the hadiths were written, all the narrations, after 150 years, 200 years, that kind of range, all of them. And the way we are now discussing about the history and the narration and the verification, those very things applies to all the narrations, the science, what we call, quote unquote, science of hadith. I don't know which branch of science is that, but regardless, it is labeled as science, but it was all developed during the time of the standard of writing history during that time. So you can judge where we stand and what material we depend for our interpretation of our own religion.
You are right, sir. But here I think I may try to submit one thing, that hadith presents a very important source. Otherwise, for that period, we don't have anything else to go for verification. Now, the approach which is required is that we should not take it as it is. This is the source. We don't treat the hadith as a source. It is the source. Now, whatever information is provided by the source, that has to be studied, that has to be excavated, that has to be verified, that has to be further elaborated on the timeline of history, in the background of Quran, in the backdrop of the Sunnah. All these things have to work together. And when we say science of hadith, here the word science is used for knowledge. Knowledge means science. Science of hadith means a knowledge of hadith. It has been systematized. That what are the criteria to judge a hadith to be agreeable and to further study. So that is why it is called science of hadith. And it is not science in the sense of abstract science or the physical science, but it is the science in the sense of knowledge of hadith, and it has been systematized. Since it has been systematized, therefore it was more appropriate to call it the science of hadith. And hadith is so sacred because it is the source. But unfortunately, people treat hadith as an end in itself. In hadith also there are broad principles which are in elaboration of the history of Sunnah, history of the Prophet, history of Islam, history of revelation, and the broader principle of Quran, which need to be explained further and acted upon further. But instead of that, we are using it as a closed ended document and an end in itself for Sawab.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question or discussion or debate?
You know, we had a channel of we had a history series, 6 months, last year and this year. And one thing I learned from those which we had organized, you were also a part of the speaker, that, we hear often that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And the lesson of the history seems to be that we have failed to learn what those lessons are. And it still is a challenge to identify what lessons we have learned.
You are right. And I think this is one of the important points in the next lecture, inshallah, next week. That is also, as in the beginning, I said that the history lectures will be two. Part one is today and the part one, inshallah, next week. And this point is very much included there in that part. And you are right that we are not taking lesson. If we don't take lesson, the history will repeat itself. The interesting point which is coming up is that if we don't take the lesson, the history will repeat itself. But if we take the lesson, history will not repeat itself.
But on the other hand, as you stated, that history is always going to keep on changing. Its viewpoint will change, its quality will change, everything is like a constant change about history. So when anything is changing all the time, can we then rely on that, number one? And I wonder sometimes what mistakes have we stopped making because of our knowledge about history? And all these questions come, of course, you're going to refer those things in your next lecture, and I'm looking forward for that. Those are the thoughts that come in my mind most of the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I meant, what I submitted was that history is a change over time. What is a change in science, if we define? It is a change from one point to the other. When the event moves from one point to the other point, that is time. And what is time? It is a change between those 2 points. So what is history? History is a change over time from one point to the other. In between that, what is in between? That is what we call event. Now, event has different angles. Somebody is looking from left, the other person is looking from right, another person is looking from the bottom, somebody is looking from outside, somebody is looking from within. Now, all this information is not becoming available at one time. It is becoming available over a period of time. Now, as the information becomes available, new information becomes available, that part of history is rewritten. It continues to be rewritten, which means that it continues to be elaborated, it continues to be expanded, it continues to be refined. And sometimes, to somebody's horror, it will come in the next lecture also, somebody's nightmare, somebody finds that the event did not take place at all. Or if it took place, it took place in a totally a different way, what we have been learning or reading till today. So history is a collection, writing of history is a collection of information over a period of time that is becoming available for further refining, for elaboration, for presentation, and all these points are different in slides I discussed these. But thank you very much that you have raised this. This is a very crucial, important point which you have raised, particularly in the last question now, which you have raised.
What is your opinion about the role of archaeology, which seems to be, it does give add some kind of verification source, some degree, than just reading a history written by the victors.
It
They
adds
say
a lot
people
of,
who have the gold makes history. They write histories. So doesn't the archaeology, and which is, there's a lot of science in that, does it help at all?
it helps a lot. It helps where its help is very important. Skeletons found in Sugarland. They
Yes.
opened up a new chapter in history.
Correct.
They threw new light on the history.
That's right.
So at that time, when Quran was revealed, or Torah was revealed, or these documents, these revelations came, they pointed out towards studying archaeology, mountains, the houses made in the mountains, the carving made in the mountains, what the route which was adopted through the sea, marjan, as I mentioned already. So these are all pointations towards the study of natural history, and within natural history, archaeology is a very important part. In my book, The Divine Dynamics, I pointed out that have we studied the archaeology? Are there any signs still remaining? When Abraha brought the elephant or elephants to conquer Mecca, to attack Kaaba, he had imported elephants from East Africa because elephant is not the animal of that territory. He had imported that. Why he imported it? What was the purpose? Why he brought it there? And if all those perished there, are there still those remains buried under the sand? If any meteor burst there, as it burst in Indonesia,
So,
then if any meteor was burst at that time near Mecca, then what are the traces available in the desert? So these all these things can be verified from archaeology if we study archaeology from that angle, but we have not undertaken any project in that regard.
say,
We have not even studied the route of Musa alayhi salam from Egypt to crossing over the sea to the desert. He built a refugee camp there. He built a town there. 12 subdivisions of a town, and there must be archaeological evidences available, but we have not explored that. Any other question? If not, then we may say thank you very much. Very nice of you for patient listening and discussion, which is very enlightening for me. Thank you very much again. Goodbye.
thank you.
Thank you.